Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live chat. I am coming to you from sweltering, steamy, hot Liberty, Missouri, just north of Kansas City, Missouri. So very glad that you are joining us for this week's live chat. We've had a great couple of chats the last couple of weeks, and I gotta tell you, I am really enjoying doing these. I love getting on right before I go live and typing out with other people and answering questions, getting their questions written down, because such great things come up before and during. So as I'm doing my presentation, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat, because Jessica's sitting over here writing them down furiously for me so I can make sure I can address them during this week's chat. Before we get on to our topic, which is going to be tips for quilting negative space, I put together 8 tips. I was going for 20, but I stopped at 8. No, I'm just kidding. I thought that's a good round number to learn. I just want to talk about a couple little things. First of all, lots and lots of questions about the next free motion challenge quilting along. That's a video series where we work together quilting through a project from start to finish. Good news, everybody. I just sent out the panel for test print today or this week, so I should be getting it back soon. And once the panel's a go, we're usually about four weeks out from actually announcing it. So it's coming together pretty quickly, and I think you're gonna love it. So I'll be sharing some sneak peeks, some little pictures, more and more as we get closer. So definitely keep that in mind. Also, great response to our last 2 live chats, the Tulip Pink Butterfly Quilt and the Picking Threads live chat. Lots and lots of people taking advantage of that weekly deal. Just want to let you know that my people are cutting furiously. They're packaging threads as fast as they can. We're a little delayed, so if you just be patient, we'll definitely get those out to you. But I do appreciate your support. Purchasing from our online store lets me keep doing this, so definitely love that. Speaking of this week's special, it's going to be 20% off the Echoes and Curves panel or the Cathedral Quilt Kit, and you're going to use the promo code THREAD to get that. Now, I'm going to show you pictures of both those in just a second, but just know that to take advantage of anything I talk about, all you have to do is click the link in the description box, and it has everything you need. Speaking of everything you need, I have put together a downloadable PDF tip sheet, and I think it's pretty amazing. It's a lot more in depth than my normal tip sheets, but I thought, man, I was just on a roll. So to download that for free, all you have to do is go to the description box and click the link. That will take you to everything that you need. And there's no cost for the PDF. I do it completely free. The only thing I ask is that if you like the PDF or the live chats, that you'll give the video a thumbs up or leave a comment, because that helps other quilters find it as well. So that's all I ask for. All right, let's talk about quilting negative space. You know I've got a bunch of pictures to share, a bunch of tips to talk about. And again, if you have questions, you can leave them in leave them in the chat, and Jessica will write those down. So first, let's talk about what is negative space. So this is a class that I have taught several times, hands-on and lecture. And when I say negative space, I kind of almost say it interchangeably with background. Now, listen, I don't have an art degree. I have a degree in fast food with a major in French fries. Not really, but so I'm sure there's a more artistic definition, but for our purposes, we're talking about the area that's around the most important parts of the quilt. Sometimes that negative area or that background is very easy to notice. So this is the Cathedral quilt. It's a very fast and fun quilt to make using raw edge applique. This is actually the kit that is 20% off for this week only. It's pretty obvious where the negative space is, or the background. It's going to be that light gray fabric. But sometimes it's not quite as noticeable, or sometimes there isn't any. So let's look at this quilt. Now this is a little mini quilt, but this was from a market several years ago. But as you look at it, you're like, okay, well maybe that white could be negative space. So there's a little bit in there, or maybe you treat that white as a whole block and there isn't any negative space at all. So when you look at a quilt, it might not be so obvious right up front. Now the negative space or the background can be what you decide to make it. So this quilt I quilted for Camille Ross Kelly of Thimble Blossoms, and she used the same background fabric for her sashing and her blocks, and it kind of gave the illusion that they were floating in between those cornerstones. Well, I decided to break up that background or that negative space by quilting an all-over swirl around the star and then treating those sashings as though they were a different fabric. So using the quilting, you can also decide what you want to be the negative space. So you don't have to just pick what comes to you. It can be lots of negative space, or it can be little bits of negative space or irregular negative space. How about this quilt? This quilt was humongous. It is all needle turn applique, and I quilted it for an exhibit for Quilt Festival years ago. And so there's not a lot of negative space, but we can see what it is, right? That cream background, because obviously the most important thing is that needle turn applique. So sometimes you think of negative space as a big area, but it can be smaller, it can be irregular shapes. So you kind of have to look at the quilt and see. Here's an example where maybe I have to use the quilting to determine the negative space or the background. This quilt is made with very similar fabrics. No one element stands out more than the other. So I could either just quilt them all the same, like blocks, or I could use the quilting to indicate which area is the negative space. And here I just quilted the borders slightly different and quilted the blocks all together. So that negative space that you determine can be decided by fabric, it could be decided by location, it could be decided for the secondary effect that you're going for. And then how about that Echoes and Curves panel? This is the other fabric that is on sale for this weekly live chat deal, 20% off the panel. And this panel was designed for a previous free motion challenge quilting along, and it does have different colors, right? It has the darker ring, the lighter ring, and then the more, piecing that blends into the background. Using the quilting, I determined that I'm going to make all that piecing around the edges, I'm going to make that the background. I don't necessarily need those blocks to show up or shine. I want the darker and the more vibrant fabrics too. So just know that you can definitely pick and choose what you want to highlight. And not to get confusing, you can actually have negative space in between your quilting designs. Like if you have a main element, what you put around it in the negative space can really show it off. Now, regardless of how much negative space you have or whether it's part of the pattern or you determine it with your quilting, the designs that you put in that negative space can really enhance the piecing. It can enhance the piecing, it can help show off other elements. So it's just as important what you put in those areas as what you put in the main part of the quilt. I always say, great quilting can enhance a quilt pattern, but it can also take away from the quilt pattern. So just being aware of that is really gonna help you out. So let's talk about some things to think about. I've kind of broken it down into 8 kind of chunks, but you have to know that whatever you put in the areas of your quilt, it's gonna be fine. So don't stress about it. Just use this as some kind of inspiration to help give you a direction to go when you're trying to decide how to quilt your quilts. Now this adorable quilt, I quilted it years ago, and this is for Robert Kaufman. I don't know the piecer or even the fabric collection, but in between those crowns, in those blocks, I wanted to use the quilting to create a secondary pattern. So when you have those larger areas of negative space, you can use the quilting to group blocks together to create secondary patterns or things to really kind of give it a more custom, elegant kind of look. Now in this particular example, if we zoom in kind of on those blocks, I use a quilting design to kind of hook them together. So nothing too crazy, nothing too over the top, but adding those kind of curved lines just kind of help those little blocks stand out. With all those crowns and things going on, I wanted them to not kind of fade into the background. Now, when you're using this, and by the way, in that downloadable PDF, all this stuff is in there, when you're trying to decide those secondary designs that you're going to work with in the background, first, just look to your blocks, look to the piecing. When you can use those reference lines that are already on your quilt, it saves you from having to mark it out, and it gives you a really cool effect. So here, just adding a couple extra lines, using the corners of the block as that guide really makes it easy and impactful even. This works best for quilts that are on a grid. Not all the time, but if you have quilts that have blocks placed out evenly, you'll have a really good option of creating designs. And this quilt is Ventana, and it was pieced by Allison Glass. And again, I did this a few years ago. It's probably in my top 20. I love how the quilting turned out on this. The negative space is that gray block, but if you look at it, it's the same shape over and over again. And I just loved the idea of kind of looking beyond the blocks and creating the secondary design. And I'm just connecting points on that block, echoing it to make sure I can see what I'm doing, and then putting some different fillers in that. Now, if you're gonna try this, just take a little time beforehand and kind of plot out your course of action, because I wanted those squares to look like they were floating behind the blocks. And so I needed to be sure I put it in the right place. And that's actually a question that Jennifer asked, what about marking the negative space to break up larger areas? And this is an example of where I might mark it out. I might mark just the first line so that I know that what goes in that block. I might mark out a section, and I'll talk a little bit as I show the pictures. I'll talk a little bit about where I might have marked that. But what's really neat about giving the quilting a secondary pattern is it's not going to overwhelm the quilt top. You still see Allison's bright, vibrant fabric. You still see the beautiful pattern, but it just creates this secondary effect that is so fun and so easy. It's just a couple of straight lines and some swirls and back and forth lines. And it just shows that quilting doesn't have to be difficult to be impactful. You can really come up with some neat effects just by changing it up a bit. Okay, so here's a little bit closer look. This is when it was on my long arm frame as I was quilting it. And since those blocks are the main thing, I mean, as much as Allison loves me, she was selling her pattern and her fabric, I kept the quilting pretty basic in those, pretty simple, and then just saved the wow quilting for the background areas. Again, since I did this on a long arm, I'm kind of working my way down in sections. So I definitely had to be sure of what was going to go where. I have in the past quilted the wrong thing in the wrong place, and then I got to get super creative on how I cover that up. But, you know, just another example of, again, using the points on the blocks, the piecing that's there, where those gray squares come together, that's pieced, and so there is a perfect center point for me. It's just like begging to be quilted. So it's pretty easy when you can look for that area. You can also do this with, you know, any kind of blocks, but again, here I've added some of those lines that connect, did a little dot to dot so that those blocks come together. This is gonna sound weird, but I trust you're not gonna think I'm weird, okay? So when I'm trying to decide what secondary pattern can I make with this, how can I connect the points on this grid and create this cool effect, I kind of stand back from the quilt, don't judge, and I let my eyes blur just a bit, and I kind of imagine where that line would go. Where if this point kept going, where would it run into the next point? If I connected this point, where would it go? A great option could also be taking a picture of the quilt and just sketching it out, you know, on your iPad or something, and options for that secondary design. Once you get the hang of it, or you get the idea of the plan, it goes together so quickly, and again, it makes a really impactful effect. This is the Night Sky pattern by Julie Herman, and again, just using that quilting in the background to group the blocks together, give that secondary design, but not taking away from her beautiful pattern. Now, I know we've seen this before. I showed some of the same pictures in several chats, but they're for different reasons. But here we have the Twist in Time quilt. This is on the Midnight Quilter. And I'm super proud of this because, you know, it's my first finished English paper piecing project. I mean, I did have lots of help on it. Jessica actually made some of the little rays, and Irene helped me put it together, but, you know, it hangs in my house, so I get to keep it. But that secondary pattern, where can I make these points touch? As I looked at the points, I thought, if this line goes there, I can just connect them and make that secondary pattern. Now, this is actually a lot of different techniques within one, but I decided to throw it in the secondary pattern section. So definitely have fun with that. This is the variable Midnight Stars from the Midnight Quilter. It's pretty easy to see where that negative space is, right? That lighter gray. But I actually kind of ignored that outer border and just treated it all as background and quilted a feather that kind of wrapped around that. And we'll see that technique here in a second, but what we're talking about now is the secondary design. What's really fun is if you're looking at the negative space, sometimes taking a very basic design, like in those light gray squares, that's some dot to dot and wishbone, but the fact that it's changing direction is what gives it that secondary pattern. So sometimes it might be as simple as having your design rotate or having them connect with each other. Sometimes you don't even have to think about matching the points, you're just quilting in that block. But what happens is as it's rotating, it's just kind of giving it that secondary pattern. And sometimes this just happens on its own. You're like, oh, look at that, I'm super genius, I made that happen. Other times you have to be intentional about where you put the designs. All right, number 2, you can mimic the piecing in the negative space. This is a quilt I did for Jackie Gehring probably in 2012, so a long time ago. And it was really one of the very first quilts that I worked on that had a lot of negative space. In fact, when I met her, we were kind of going over design ideas. I think this was for a book or a pattern. And she's like, well, I really want to enhance the negative space. And I'm like, absolutely, no problem. And then I went home and I went on ask.com, because that was before Google. I knew about Google, and I asked, like, what is negative space? I don't know what I'm supposed to be highlighting here. Oh, it turns out all this fabric. So using the quilting to mimic the blocks in that negative space is just a fun way to enhance the pattern, to give it some repetition, to break up that negative space and make it a little bit easier. This works best for quilts with a lot of background / negative space. It works for quilts that works best for quilts that have not overly complex blocks. If it's a very complex block, I don't want to try marking the whole thing out and trying to quilt it. But these blocks were all different sizes, so they didn't even have to be the same size. and they were really easy to quickly quilt. Now, you might find marking helpful here, especially if it's a block like a star or something that needs symmetry. Marking the block out beforehand will really help you just get comfortable with quilting it. But one rule of thumb that I follow is once I quilt that mimicked block in the negative space, I quilt it the same way I quilt the regular blocks. That'll give it the repetition and help it be obvious that that's what's going on. And if you like the block, add some echoing around the outside to help separate it from the rest of the filler. Because we don't have that fabric to help it pop off, we need to give it a little bit of separation so that people can see it. Here's the thing, if I take the time to quilt all these different blocks on here, I kind of want it to be noticeable. So definitely give it a little bit of echoing to separate it. You can look to negative space that are even between blocks. So here we have, I did this quilt for a gal that worked at Robert Kaufman. And it was awesome. It was like highlight yellow and white, and I did all sorts of those blocks, mimicking them in the area, connecting them, quilting them upside down, having a lot of fun with that. It was really, really cool. So when you're looking at your quilt, it doesn't have to be just a block. You can kind of create that block and work it in different ways. And this could also be creating a secondary pattern. It's very similar to that, but what I'm basically doing is recreating those blocks and quilting them the same way and using the filler around it. This is actually from the dot to dot quilting challenge. I had a picture of the full quilt, but it just wasn't very good, so I just threw this in there real quick. Again, using echoing to separate it from the filler. If you have a quilt that's bold enough that isn't going to be easily overwhelmed, quilting that block in a slightly different thread color will help it pop off as well. So even though this is a gray background, I quilted that block in like this lime green thread that was still on the lighter side. It just helped it pop off just a bit, but not so much that it was screaming, "Look at me." And then again, adding that echoing. Now this echoing is a little different. It's dot to dot echoing around the outside of that block, but the result is still the same. It does give it a little bit of separation from that filler. So again, if you quilt that block and you love it, add some echoing to separate it. It's really gonna help it stand out. Again, this is gonna be better for areas of larger areas of space, but also more solid and tonal fabrics. If this is a busier background, I'm not gonna take all the time to do all this work because you're not gonna see it anyway. If it's a busier fabric, I'm probably just gonna do it all over. This is a quilt I found while kind of going back through my old pictures. This is a quilt I did for Tula Pink, and it's been a few years ago, of course. I'm trying to find pictures you all haven't already seen. And it was a really stunning quilt, because it was hexagons and then all this background. And Tula does not always give me a ton of background, so you know, when she gives me places to play, I'm gonna play. And I kind of loved how the hexagons ended in half hexagons, and I decided to extend that out into the negative space, and then also create that mimic block as though it's continuing. And I kind of wish I had done it even more because I just love how it turned out. So when you're mimicking the blocks, they don't have to be whole blocks separate. Maybe it's something like that where it's a half block. You can kind of pull it out into the background or borders, or you can add just a few blocks as you go. So you don't even have to do a ton. You don't have to do a few. You can just make it whatever you like. I always say start out with one or two, and then if you like it, you can add more. But those mimicking those blocks would be really fun. And you can tell inside the blocks, I quilted them the same way as I did the other blocks. Not totally necessary, but I just want to make it extra clear that this is what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a mimicked block. And here's just a little bit closer up of that. I'll talk about in a second about what you put around your designs to make them show off. And this particular design, that wavy line, is just kind of contrasting in direction. It's not super dense compared to that design. It's just helping that pop off just a bit because the direction is a little different. In fact, that's a question that Jennifer asked. She said, does the density in the negative space have to match the rest of the quilt? And not necessarily. You can change up the density if you want. Just know though, anytime there's a contrast, it's gonna draw attention. So if you're quilting the rest of the blocks really loose and you quilt the background really small, then it's gonna make those blocks pop out, which is great if that's what you want. So you don't have to worry about that. Okay, technique number 3, adding fun details to the quilting. I try to think of a different word besides fun. I tend to overuse the word fun, but it's all fun, so I don't guess I care. The details are a really cool way to show off the inspiration behind the quilt, to add a little bit of detail to it, and also to give it a whimsical touch. I think quilting can be serious. I think it can be very artsy, but I like to have fun, and I find stuff like this very amusing. So this particular quilt, I don't have a full picture of it, but it was a quilt for Tula, and it was had columns, and she said she wanted creepy feathers. So I'm like, okay, I can do creepy feathers. Like, this is why I love working with her, right? Who else says quilt creepy feathers? And nothing says creepy more than spiders. So adding a little spider web here and there just add a little bit of detail to it. Kind of pulled out some of the fun elements that were in the fabric. And then this is, Charlotte, of course. So Charlotte quilted out Tula in the spider web. So again, I am so easily amused. I think of these things as I'm quilting them. I'm like, oh yeah, it's like Charlotte's web. Look, you're quilting the name. But I put some spider webs in the feathers and in other areas. So it can be really fun that way. It doesn't have to be literal. It doesn't have to be like thread painting. It doesn't have to be like, okay, I need the fur of the cat, right? This is a cute little kitty quilt I quilted for Georgiana, one of our employees. And I just thought, well, every cat needs some whiskers and maybe a little tongue, right? So again, it doesn't have to be literal. It doesn't have to be a lot. You don't have to go overboard. Just adding a few details here and there is really easy and whimsical way to do it. Other things you can do in the negative space, if there's meaningful details or dates or things about the quilt, you can quilt those in as well. The joke is, if I make a quilt for my nieces and nephews, I'm going to quilt Aunt Angela is your favorite, right? Stuff like that is really cute. It can also help show the inspiration behind the design. And this is a quilt I use. I probably used it during our Help How Do I Quilt It live chat. I use it anytime I do a How to Quilt It. Because the inspiration of this pattern was Gothic arches. And to me, though, I didn't really see that until she mentioned it. So using the quilting to add those details might make the inspiration a little bit more clear, right? So I can see the brickwork here, the little details, the echoing around the arches. Just, again, nothing super literal, nothing super difficult or over the top, just little peeps here and there just to make it fun and to give it a little more interest. All right, the next one is adding texture to the background areas. This is perfect for quilts that have irregularly shaped areas. This is perfect for quilts where you don't want to overwhelm the quilt top, the piecing. This is for backgrounds where you're like, look, your only job here quilting is to look pretty, but don't look prettier than the blocks. So adding texture is a great way to do that. And when I say texture, I just mean that no one part of the design shows up more than the other. The spacing is consistent. And so here, just adding those serpentine lines in between these stripped pieces is going to give it a nice texture. It's nice and similar throughout the whole thing. And so it just looks great and doesn't overwhelm the piecing. Now here, it might look like the quilting is pretty over the top. That's just because I've edited the picture so that you could see the quilting. If you're wanting to add texture to your quilt without overwhelming your piecing, one thing to remember is to use a thread color that matches your background. Very important, because we don't want the quilting to show up. We want that beautiful texture, that consistent density, whatever it is, and just filling in the area of the whole thing. Now, when I do the free motion challenge quilting alongs, we've seen, if you've been through any of them, you've heard me say a million times that people will notice a gap in the quilting before they notice an error. What does that mean? It means if there's a contrast, a difference in density, like I just talked about, a difference in spacing or whatever, that's going to pop out. So in this instance, we don't want any one area to pop out. We just want that nice, consistent texture. And what I love about this is anytime I got a quilt that was strip pieced, it's like, thank you. I've got all my guidelines already there for me. I don't have to worry about it. Now you can create guidelines. You can, add those in and fill it in. It doesn't have to be straight and perfect. It just needs to be consistent. Even if it's consistently inconsistent, as long as it's consistent. So adding that texture, and it can be any shape. So even though when we think of texture, I think of curves and swirls, it can be straight lines, it can be anything you want as long as the spacing is consistent. They can go different directions, you can have different traveling bits. And this is actually from a sample that I quilted of like silky fabric. This is really tight, echoing wavy lines where they get closer and further apart. But even though there's that touch of different density, it's consistent. It's not just one place. It's happening over and over again. So this is a perfect example of consistently inconsistent. Okay, talking about texture. So here's that echoes and curves panel from the challenge I was telling you about. It's actually bigger than this. It's just kind of cut in for you. You can actually use the quilting to make the negative space. So again, like I said, there's that main thing in the middle. We were learning serpentine lines, we were learning echoing, we were learning all this thing to really show that off. And in the background, I just went ahead and quilted, those serpentine lines that we saw, just because that's just what we happen to learn there. And again, giving it nice, consistent texture. It doesn't have to be within a set thing. You can kind of use the quilting to determine what is that negative space. So this is obviously a quilt panel, but the piecing, I'm just ignoring that and I'm quilting it like the background. Now, The one thing you can do is if you want to pull out a little bit, a block or something and show it off, you can quilt it slightly different and it's just going to help it pop out. And if you look at the bottom, you'll see there's 2 triangles, one pointing each way, with some echo lines, little tiny bit difference in density, a little bit different design. It just helps them stand out a little bit. So if you're quilting along your quilt and you're like, oh, this block actually turned out the way it was supposed to, then you can make it show off with a slightly different design. And here's a little bit closer up of it. So that texture can be whatever you want it to be. All right, next we're gonna break it up. We're gonna break up those bigger areas of negative space and we're gonna make them more manageable. Now, what that means is if you're quilting on a sewing machine or you're quilting on really any machine, long arm, whatever, if you have a big area of negative space, that can be really daunting. I like to joke that the easier a quilt is to piece, the harder it is to quilt. You know, you're like, oh, look, it's a one big star. It went together so fast. I've got all this area to quilt. Then you're like, crap, I've got all this area to quilt. And so by using the quilting to break it up and make it more manageable is going to help you out. Now, you can do that a couple different ways. I'll show you some different examples here. This example, I'm using a big design that kind of works its way down, that paisley feather, one of my favorites. And if you wanted it to be a certain way, or you want to go a certain way, you could mark a reference line. And that reference line will just give you something to follow when filling it in. We'll come back to that. These are a little bit out of order. This one is going to be motifs. So adding a motif to your quilting. This is perfect when you want to add a little bit of an elegant touch to your quilt, or if you have a negative space or a irregularly shaped negative space to fill in. So this is another quilt I did for Jackie Gehring. It's called the Tin Ceiling. And I loved the negative space where those teal blocks kind of came together. And so I thought quilting this motif where it's a self-contained design that is meant to kind of draw attention to it, but by using the same thread color, it keeps it from overwhelming the quilt top. But that piecing, those blocks are pieced with bright and colorful selvages. I don't think there was a whole lot I could have done to overwhelm it. Speaking of motifs, in irregular shapes, here I have Tula Pink's Cartwheels quilt. This is the first one I ever did for her. And so in between those wheels, or those cartwheels, I decided to quilt a motif. So this kind of swirl that comes out, kind of radiates around. It just helped fill in that weird space that I had right there. It kind of, you know, if you continue the motif, it gives it that secondary pattern, and it just looks really, really nice. So when you're quilting your motifs, you can really have fun with the placement of them. And when you quilt it, you can decide, do I want this motif to stand out? Do I want to add, you know, really dense quilting around it? Or do I want to blend in a little bit more? And you can kind of play with how much it's going to show off and hide in that area. And then here, it doesn't have to be curvy, it doesn't have to be feathery, it can be any kind of shape. So again, a self-contained design that just kind of fills in an area and gives it a really cool look. And there's just something elegant about that, something that gives it a little bit more of a custom look, and it's definitely a lot of fun. Now we're back to the break it up section. So in this particular quilt, I have Tula Pink's Bjorn Bear quilt, and this is one of my favorites. I guess if I always say they're my top 20, it's going to be obvious I have a lot of quilts in my top 20. Maybe more than 20. But there wasn't a lot of negative space to this quilt, you know, just the area in between the bears. And so I decided to break it up, but also use the quilting to kind of create this look of depth. And what I did is I quilted this feather and made it look like it's running behind the blocks of the quilt. So again, marking that out ahead of time might be helpful. Where do I want it to hide and where do I want to overlap? We'll just kind of give you a range. But as I quilt that chunk of feather, now I have one area over here to fill in and one area over there to fill in. It just kind of makes it a little bit easier. So you can break it up in any way that you want. You can play around with oversized designs like this feather, make them really big over the top, make them go in different directions. You know, you can wrap them around and make them look like they're going behind the bear. I could say like, oh, I just love how the juxtaposition of it with the bear, but I just wanted to quilt a feather and I couldn't fit it in there any other way. Or you can use more basic designs just to break it up and make it a little bit easier. I threw this one in here because that is also a needle turn applique quilt, and it was just a big irregular shape that was the border. And I'm like, okay, I've already done feathers everywhere. How can I change this up? And so by quilting some brackets, and then by filling one side in with pebbles and one side with wishbones, you can really break it up any way you want. You can, you know, quilt motifs, add more details in there. This is really where your imagination can run wild. And so even if you want to take a moment and just kind of plot it out, what it's going to do is make that whole area easier to manage, right? It's like, how do I eat an elephant one bite at a time? But it's just going to make it, you know, easier to progress. It was great because somebody on the chat beforehand said, what do you do if you have a really big border? Well, you just quilt a really big design. So if you have a negative space, use an oversized design to break it up and make it a little bit easier. Now, I get that you might be thinking, I have a hard time quilting a swirl of this size. How am I going to quilt one bigger? Well, you can practice and get a little bit better, but there was a great question that came through, like how do you see behind the needle when you're quilting on your sewing machine? So as you're working in different directions in this negative space, you're going to have to kind of, okay, this is what I do. It's probably not the best posture, but I kind of peer over to the side and peek behind there. But it's not going to be perfect. Instead, I'm trusting on keeping that line smooth, and if it's smooth, it's going to look fine. So marking it out beforehand will give you a line to follow as well. So you just have to kind of see just past the needle to get where you're going. But one great thing about quilting on a sewing machine is you can easily tweak it to the side, so you're moving in a slight diagonal so you can see where you're going, or just turn the quilt and go the different direction. All right, breaking it up can, like I said, it can be done in a number of ways. This one was the iCat moth. I think I said that right. It was from the book I did with Tula. And that background, I just kind of quilted these big swirls that just kind of popped out everywhere, and it just, I don't know, it took that big negative space where I couldn't really fit anything super ornate, and it kind of made it to have little pockets to fill in. Now, the reason they pop out so much is because that dense filler that's around them and the side light that I put so that I could, really show off the difference there. But again, you can really have fun with this. This big border, I started with a swirl chain, I put some wavy lines, I filled in between it. I could have changed up the orientation. I mean, really, really fun. If you don't want those individual designs to overwhelm, what you can do is use a matching thread color. That's going to be key. If you want to show them off because you're like, dang, this looks amazing, a slightly contrasting thread will do the trick. All right, the next one is kind of a twofer. You can change up the scale or combine designs. This is a really easy way to take something that's familiar and latch onto it without having to really go crazy with the big feathers and the big swirls. This is great for quilts that have negative space or backgrounds of all sizes. And if you're really comfortable with one design, but maybe want to tiptoe into another. Okay, so this particular quilt is an example of changing up the scale of the quilting. So as the pebbles are smaller at the top and as they come down, they get bigger. Well, let's be honest, it's a lot easier to quilt just a few small pebbles than all of them. Giving that gradual change of scale or size is what's going to kind of give it interest without taking away from the rest of the quilt. And this is another example where I would mark out register lines. So I might mark out a couple of lines across the quilt to know, like, these are the smallest ones, these are the medium, and these are the large, knowing that when I erase the lines, you'll just see that beautiful texture. So if I only know how to meander, and I really still want to add some interest to the negative space of my quilt, I can do that just by changing up the scale. You can play around with making it smaller in the middle and bigger as you go out, like I did top down. You can really have fun with that. And this is just zoomed in a little bit more. And again, it's a lot easier, or a lot quicker to quilt designs bigger than smaller, so I still get the impact, I still get to show off those tiny pebbles, I just didn't have to do it over the whole area. Combining designs is one of my favorites as well. Combining designs allows you to transition from one to another, or mixing them up together, depends on what you're going for. This is great. If you feel comfortable with a design, let's say you finally got swirls down, you feel comfortable, well, combining them with a design that makes it a little, that you're not quite comfortable with, just a little bit of practice, allows you to transition into that new design without freaking out and jumping into brand new designs altogether. So most designs will combine with each other, just sketched out beforehand. They're kind of like handwriting. They just kind of hook together. So you can play around and create some different effects. And you can combine several designs. Depends on how over the top you're trying to go, how much you're showing off. But this particular quilt, I love throwing in clamshells and paisleys and pebbles. But here's the thing, if you don't want the individual pieces to stand out, you want the density to be the same. You don't want any contrast, so that would be more like the texture. But here, I'm quilting with shiny gold thread. I don't think I'm worried about it showing up. So adding those clamshells with that pop of bigger texture and those pebbles that are a little smaller allows those individual pieces to show up. And you can see it right there. Clamshells are a really fun one to combine designs. I might have to include that on a live chat sometime. All right, the last one that kind of brings it up all together is you can combine all the different techniques, right? So you don't have to just say, ooh, I'm gonna do this or this. You can do all the things, and that's when quilting becomes really fun. You can break up the area like I did in this one. It's another zoomed in picture of that Tula Pink quilt. I just wanna show you how I have some wavy lines, I have some straight lines. You can use the fabric as a guide as you're picking your designs. And you can fill in between those things with lots of different designs. So in this particular example, I'm breaking it up, I'm combining different designs, I'm making ghost block or mimicking the blocks, I'm doing all the things. Now this particular quilt is a perfect example of all the things. So the inspiration behind this quilt, I think I've showed it before, but it's supposed to look like a laurel or a wreath. And so I wanted that inspiration. I wanted to add details with more feather or more leaves and more echoing. I decided to add motifs in that negative space on the top and bottom. And then in the rest of the quilt, I used the quilting to break it up into sections to make it easier to quilt. So again, you don't have to just pick one. You can do all the things. And let's end on my favorite quilt of this week. It's that cathedral quilt I was telling you about. There's an episode on the Midnight Quilter. You can watch it come together. Very, very easy. So much fun. But in the negative space, I just really had fun doing a lot of different things. So in the corners, quilting those swirl chains nice and big to break it up. Also create a secondary pattern. Adding some texture with the swirls, but also creating secondary designs in the negative space between those blocks. So again, the negative space that you're dealing with is not going to always be large. It might be smaller, it might be irregular shaped, but coming up with those secondary designs is going to be lots of fun. Now I didn't include this one in there, but playing with a thread color. I did kind of hint on that a little bit on the mimicking the blocks, but you can really create these subtle effects by changing your thread color as well. And lastly, before I answer your questions, again, you can see that texture with the swirls, the secondary pattern with those bubbles going around, echoing, all the different things. And so you really can experiment and find what it is that you like. And I know the question is always, if I'm in a class, if I could read your mind, you might be thinking, but how do I know what I should do? Just get started. Try some different things out, and as you progress, you'll find very quickly what you do and don't like, what works and what doesn't work. So you have to remember that as you're working through your quilts, it's going to be fun, and you change it up, and then if you learn something new to do different next time, even better. All right, so do we have any questions? No questions, huh? Nobody had anything? I was like, oh my gosh, she's going to get writer's cramp over there writing them out. How do I balance heavily quilted areas with lesser quilted areas? Okay, so it's so funny. When I started teaching, I realized there were things that people worried about that I didn't even worry about. So I'm like, crap, I got to start worrying about that. And the difference in density would be one of them. Now, when I talk about changing density, I'm not talking about micro quilting to like big areas of unquilted area. It's a range. You can have a range in between. And so how I balance it is what do I want to show with the quilting? If I'm trying to show off this particular area, that's where the tighter quilting goes, that's where the denser quilting goes, and the rest kind of doesn't. And the question that also comes along with that would be like, well, is it going to not lay flat when you're done? And there is a chance of that if it doesn't lay flat because the quilting kind of ripples it up. You could do blocking the quilt where you spray it and get it wet and get it flat. But if it's going on a bed, it's going to be fine. It's going to look great. Again, don't do anything that I say and expect to win a ribbon at a show. That's a totally different thing. So what thread do I use? I love threads. If you haven't checked out last week's live chat, you should do that because I talk all about how to pick thread colors. I use all the threads. I love all the threads, but my go-to thread right now is Glide. It's a 40 weight poly thread with just a bit of sheen. But a lot of these quilts were quilted a few years ago, and the quilting is a little bit more matte. That's quilted with So Fine thread. It's a 50 weight poly, but it's just a more matte, thinner thread. And so the thread that you should use depends on what effect you're going for. If you want that quilting to disappear, then you're going to use that slightly thinner thread. But I feel like 40 to 50 weight is like the perfect spot. It's thin enough to blend in, but it's not so thin that it's finicky to deal with. When you get to the extremes, the 100 weight or the 12 weight, you can quilt with them and they look great, but just know that you have to make some adjustments to that. So see, I'm answering questions you didn't even ask. Do I use a water-soluble marker? Yes, I do. That's my marking utensil of choice. It has always come out for me, so I'm just going to stick with it. In fact, in the Cathedral Midnight Quilter, you kind of see me marking out the designs and registration lines. I show a little bit about what I mark. I'm not marking every single thing. I'm just giving myself general registration lines to go with. I only seem to be quilting in straight lines. Any advice to get back into curved motions? Wine does the trick. Have a glass of wine, try to quilt a straight line, it will be wavy, no problem. Okay, I'm just kidding, kind of. I like wine, but not everybody does. Okay, when you're good at something and you want to get into something else, that is scary, right? You're like, I'm good at this, I suck at that, I don't want to suck. Well, you have to embrace the suck and know that there is some suckiness that goes with it. But what we're gonna do is instead of like going all the way, freaking out, we're going to transition. So let's say you're like, I can straight line quilt, no problem. Perfect. Do some straight lines. Then come back in between one of them and just add some loops. That's it. I mean, you could even hold your breath and you're not going to pass out in that time frame, right? Do a wiggly line. Just do anything that's a little bit different. And then as you add more, you'll get more comfortable, and then pretty soon you'll be doing wavy lines, and then you'll do a line that meanders. So think of it like a transitioning. Like, what do I feel comfortable? How can I transition? This is especially the case for people that use computerized quilting systems. So I'm a handy quilter dealer. I sell the Pro Stitcher. It's amazing. But what happens is they think this computer makes it perfect and my free motion doesn't look great. How do I get to that? Well, I'm always saying quilt out a couple of rows, leave yourself some space in between, and just add some echo lines, add some wavy lines, just fill it in, and it's going to help you tiptoe into that transition. And just know that as you grow in any creative endeavor, you're just going to keep getting a little bit more uncomfortable until you get comfortable, and a little bit more until you get comfortable, and keep going. And then don't be afraid. Everybody has been there. We've all been freaked out about the designs we're picking. And lastly, which stitch length do I recommend? Well, I don't know. I actually don't use a stitch regulator. So I learned without one, and so my stitches are what I call organic stitch length, where they kind of juxtapose with tinier ones and bigger ones. That's only half serious. I honestly don't worry about stitch length. Again, that was another thing I didn't know I was supposed to worry about until it was too late. But for newer quilters that have a stitch regulator, so for instance, my new long arm owners, I always say 10 to 12 stitches per inch is a good range. For smaller designs like pebbles, I might do more stitches per inch so that I get that nice curve. And for longer, more fluid lines, I might make them 12 stitches per inch so that I can, move smoothly through that. But again, it's totally a personal preference. And if any of you have any advice on that, leave it in the comment section, because I don't use it, so I'm not always the best advice giver on that. But I always joke, as long as I don't get my foot caught in a stitch as I pull the quilt over me, it's fine. And stitch length is one of those things that will kind of work itself out the more comfortable you get with the design. So I know right now all those perfectionists out there are getting a little scratchy behind your neck, like, ooh, that sounds crazy. You can definitely have all your stitches the same length. It's whatever makes you happy. Well, thanks for joining me. I hope you feel more empowered and more excited about quilting those background/negative space areas of your quilt. Use your quilting or your marking to make it more manageable, make it easier on yourself, but try something a little uncomfortable, and I think you might be happy with how it turns out. Well, I'll be back next week with our next live chat, and don't forget about this week's live chat deal. It's only good for the week, so it's only good until next Thursday, and you can get 20% off the Cathedral quilt if you want to try quilting some negative space, or the Echoes and Curves if you want to try grouping the blocks together with negative space designs. Well, I will see you